They didn't just fence off my land. They locked me out of my own food. No notice. No conversation. Just a steel gate, fresh concrete posts, and a laminated HOA seal zip-tied like a warning tag. And the kicker? I was still paying property tax on it. My name is Marla Tisdale, 57, retired USDA soil surveyor. I don't wear pearls. I wear work boots. And for the last 10 years, I've grown 2 acres of produce on the edge of what used to be farmland long before the houses crept in. Cherry tomatoes, snap peas, red okra. Half of it donated to the school lunch pantry. The rest? Sold on Sundays, out of a truck bed. Simple, honest food. But apparently, unsightly to passers-by, according to the HOA newsletter that came folded in my mailbox 2 weeks before the fence showed up. They didn't name me directly, just circled phrases like vegetable sprawl, property uniformity, and neighborhood appeal. I knew it was about me. I just didn't think they'd be that bold. It happened on a Thursday. I drove back from the feed store with burlap sacks and trellising wire, stopped short when I saw a crew in neon vests installing corner posts in the gravel. They had already dug around the irrigation lines. One of them had his boot resting on my sprinkler head like it was a rock. I got out and asked who authorized this. They pointed me to a clipboard held by a man I'd later come to know far too well, Lyle Granger, vice chair of the Briarwood Ridge. HOA, we're enclosing common use space, he said. I told him it wasn't common. It was mine. He flipped through his laminated printout and said, our records say otherwise. So I went home, pulled out my own records, a land plat from 1983 when my late husband and I bought the 5-acre parcel, back when this whole place was just unpaved roads and deer tracks. I brought it to the HOA office the next morning. Showed the front desk lady the clearly marked triangle labeled Parcel C, Tisdale. She squinted, smiled, said she'd have someone review it. That was Friday. By Monday, a padlock had been added to the gate, and by Tuesday, my crops were starting to wilt. Let me make one thing clear. I've been patient most of my life, fought tougher battles than this, outlasted men with more money and less sense. But something about being locked out of food I grew with my own hands made me colder than I'd ever felt. I didn't curse, didn't call a lawyer, didn't even call the sheriff. I walked the perimeter, took pictures, measured from the last known landmark, the bend in Creek Road where the storm drain cuts east, and realized something they clearly hadn't. Their new common area fence ran 4 feet inside their own setback line, but their gate, that polished iron archway with the HOA logo welded on top. That gate was built on a separate micro lot, a sliver of land just 22 feet wide with its own parcel ID. And it wasn't owned by the HOA. It was owned by a holding company. I spent 3 hours that night combing the county GIS, pulled deeds, ownership transfers, corporate filings, and there it was, Parcel 47G, formerly a utility access easement, had quietly changed hands in 2009. The holding company that bought it dissolved in 2014. Ownership had defaulted to a tax sale list, unclaimed, unbought, unguarded. That night, I filled out the claim paperwork, paid $234 in back taxes, and waited. The county clerk called 3 days later. Congratulations, Ms. Tisdale. You now own Parcel 47G. I thanked her, hung up, and poured myself a glass of well-earned iced tea, because that gate, the one they locked me out with, was sitting on my land. But I didn't move the fence, didn't cut the lock, didn't send a warning, because revenge isn't loud, it's patient, documented, and irreversible. The next week, Lyle Granger held an HOA beautification walk, a small tour of what he called improvements to shared, community features. I joined the back of the group, said nothing. He stopped by the gate, praised the ironwork, mentioned future plans for a bench and flower bed. I raised a hand. "Excuse me," I said. "Is the HOA insuring this parcel?" He blinked. "Yes, of course, it's HOA maintained property." I smiled, nodded, and quietly walked away, because he had just publicly admitted to insuring, altering, and accessing a gate sitting entirely on privately owned land. Mine. The next letter I sent wasn't angry. It was professional, printed on linen, paper, certified, signed by a notary, to the board of Briarwood Ridge, HOA. As the legal owner of Parcel 47G, effective immediately, I am revoking all unauthorized structures, improvements, or access pathways under your control. Should your members or contractors wish to use this access point in the future, a lease agreement must be negotiated. Failure to comply within 10 business days will result in the removal of all physical encroachments per county ordinance per 12.41. Respectfully, Marla Tisdale owner, Parcel 47GI sent a copy to their insurance provider and another to the city permitting office. And then I waited. Because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is nothing. Just let the paperwork settle like dust. Let them walk through gates they no longer own, until the moment they find out the key doesn't matter anymore. Want to? See how I turned a $234 land grab into a quiet chokehold on their entire entrance? The certified letter hit their desk on a Wednesday. By Friday, the lock on the gate had been changed. Again. But this time not by me. Which meant either one of two things had happened. The HOA was doubling down, pretending the gate was still theirs. Or they hadn't even read the letter. Either way, I had time on my side. Because once you've filed a property enforcement notice with the city and copied their insurance carrier, silence becomes the most loaded response of all. The first reaction came in sideways. A real estate agent, not one of the board members, showed up at my door on Sunday morning. "Well, Ms. Tisdale," she said with a too-wide smile, "there's some confusion over a parcel you might have inadvertently acquired. The HOA is interested in buying it back at a generous rate to prevent future misunderstandings." I offered her sweet tea. She declined. So I declined, too. "Parcel 47G is not for sale," I said. "And misunderstandings tend to fade when the paper trail is this clear." She left with a sigh. But I could already feel it shifting. The desperation had started leaking into the public layer. Monday morning, Lyle Granger's name showed up in my inbox. Not a formal email, just a scanned copy of a request for easement negotiation, thinly veiled, badly formatted, clearly drafted without legal review. It read, "Briarwood Ridge HOA formally requests discussion regarding limited continued access to Parcel 47G, which it believes to be a shared-use improvement area maintained in good faith." I printed it, laughed once, then slid it into a file labeled Missteps, because the moment they admitted it was shared use, they disqualified themselves from exclusive possession, which meant their insurance coverage. Void. That week, I filed an encroachment complaint with the city zoning board, not vindictively, just thoroughly attached, current parcel plat, certified deed photos of the gate. Their public beautification quote from the newsletter, the insurance flyer referencing HOA managed access feature, Eleanor, my retired legal friend from church, reviewed. "It over dinner. You didn't leave them a single foothold," she said, impressed. "That's the point," I replied. "No leverage, no exit." By Friday, I received a visit, this time from Rick Halstead, an HOA board member not known for subtlety. He didn't knock gently. "Ms. Tisdale," he barked. "This is getting out of hand." "No, Rick," I said calmly. "This is just beginning to get organized." He pointed at the gate. "You're threatening access to a community zone. You mean the zone sitting on my land? It's a bad look. Everyone sees this. Kids walk by there. It makes people nervous." I nodded. "So does trespassing." He fumed. "We're trying to resolve this like neighbors." No, you're trying to pretend the deed doesn't matter. I'm not interested in pretending. The next HOA meeting was strained. I didn't attend. Never have. But the minutes were publicly posted. Item 5B, parcel dispute and emergency budget adjustment. Item 5C, legal consultation authorization, up to $7,500. And best of all, Item 7A, alternative access path discussion. They were looking for another way in, because now they knew the only key they had wasn't theirs. But here's the part that made me pause. During the zoning review process, I learned something they hadn't accounted for. The parcel wasn't just a gate. It was also the main fire lane easement, designated in 1998 during subdivision phase planning. And under current fire code, you can't legally block or redirect the only fire department access point without county approval and a secondary exit, which they didn't have. Meaning, if I revoked gate access entirely, the entire HOA was out of fire code compliance. I didn't pull that trigger. Not yet. Because quiet revenge isn't just about leverage, it's about timing. So instead, I requested a conditional meeting, a non-binding community input session hosted by the HOA, recorded for transparency. I said I'd present one fair option. They accepted, mostly because they assumed I was coming to negotiate. Arrived with one folder. Inside, a proposed 10-year lease, $1 annual lease fee, 12 usage conditions. One mandatory clause, no alterations, branding, or expansion allowed on the parcel without written approval from the leaseholder. In short, they could use the gate, but only under my rules. And if they violated it, the lease terminated immediately. Lyle opened his mouth to argue. But Kevin, that newer board member with the accounting background, stopped him. "This keeps us in code," he said quietly. "We can't afford a second exit project. And it keeps her as the legal owner. We'd lose a fight." Badly. The vote passed, 7-2. I didn't smile. Just signed the lease, passed it across the table, and stood up. No grand speech. No, I told you so. Just, you fenced me out. Now every resident walks through my land to get home. Let's not forget that again. The gate remains, still there, still locked. But every board meeting now begins with a pledge to honor external leaseholder agreements. And every contractor the HOA hires gets a packet that includes my lease terms. They stopped calling it common land. Now they call it licensed access, because words matter, especially when they're backed by legal structure. Want to see how the lease turned permanent and how I made sure no HOA could ever override it, even if they tried decades later? 3 weeks after the lease went into effect, I got a call from Eleanor. "You've done it," she said. "They're pinned, but if you want it to last, you need to think beyond the next board election." "I already have," I replied, because quiet victories are never about this year's fight. They're about forever. The first step was subtle, a title addendum filed with the county clerk. It referenced the existing lease, cross-indexed with the fire access designation, and, most critically, codified a third-party trust as lease successor, meaning if I died or sold or gifted the parcel, the lease conditions stayed locked in. The only way they could ever change it? Buy the land from the trust. And the trust's charter? This land shall never be sold to any entity with governing or enforcement powers over it. That includes HOAs, forever. Lyle sent a letter, then another. The first asked to discuss perpetuity limitations. The second requested lease renegotiation to reflect evolving community needs. Both were ignored, not out of spite, but because legally I wasn't required to respond. The parcel had been transferred to the Tisdale Garden Access Trust, and trusts don't chit-chat. They send policy statements. By fall, the new board president, a younger woman named Clara Navarro, asked for a meeting. I agreed. We met on neutral ground, a bench by the gate I now legally owned. Clara arrived with a folder, sat beside me, and said something none of her predecessors had. "We weren't here when this started, but we live with the outcome. I'd like to understand how to avoid another trap." That word, trap, caught me, because she wasn't wrong. It had been a trap. Not malicious, just precise, and it was working exactly as intended. I told Clara the whole story, from the zoning map to the tax sale to the fire code clause. She listened, asked questions, took notes. Then she said, "I get it now. You didn't just win, you changed the board's DNA." "Good," I replied. That was the point. Meanwhile, the HOA's legal team had changed. Their new firm, Wagner and Kellogg, sent a flurry of info requests to the county. Copies of the lease fire lane designation files, permit reviews for the gate install, and in the middle of it all, a copy of the HOA's own insurance binder surfaced. I clearly stated, access structures not built on HOA-owned land must carry written usage authorization or may void liability coverage, which meant every time a child ran past that gate, they were at risk. And every time a contractor parked nearby, same thing, unless they followed the lease, which was now enforced by an external trust, not a resident. Rick Halstead resigned that winter. No announcement, no ceremony, just a line in the meeting minutes. Director Halstead stepping down for personal reasons. But I heard the rumor. His real estate license had been suspended. Something about improper disclosure on a home he sold inside Briarwood. The buyer found out, after closing, that their primary access point sat on leased land, and they weren't happy. The panic really started when the HOA tried to build a new welcome sign. The design was flashy, raised lettering, solar lighting, community branding. They even got approval from the city, except for one issue. The sign required ground anchors that would be drilled on parcel 47G. They submitted the permit. It was denied. Why? Because the parcel's registered land use restriction stated, "No structural additions permitted without explicit trustee approval." They never got it, so the sign never went up. And the residents? They noticed. What happened to the new entrance? Wasn't it approved? We raised dues. For this, where did the money go? Clara handled it the best she could, but the damage was done because now the residents knew. There was a sliver of land right under their feet that didn't answer to them. And worse, it answered to me. By spring, the trust had done its job, filed the covenant updates, created an evergreen enforcement clause with a rolling 10-year automatic renewal, and it added one final detail. Any violation or unauthorized alteration of the leased parcel shall result in immediate termination and public notice of revocation, meaning if they broke the terms, not only would the lease end, the county would record it, and every future buyer would see it. I wasn't trying to ruin their neighborhood. I just wanted them to understand. You can't fence off someone's work, ignore their history, and expect silence in return. You want uniformity? Start with respect. The HOA tried one last thing, a petition, circulated quietly, aimed at acquiring the parcel through community buyout. They needed 2-3 homeowner approval. They got 28%. Turns out, even the people who disliked me liked having someone smarter than the board holding the leash. I still grow tomatoes, still donate to the school pantry, and every now and then I walk down to the gate, lean against the fence, and watch the traffic roll past. Kids on scooters, parents jogging. A golden retriever named Max, who always tries to sneak into the garden. And every one of them walks through land protected by a woman they once locked out. Want to see how Marla's final move doesn't just protect the gate, but turns it into a permanent access toll for every future HOA attempt to expand, rezone, or rebuild. I was never interested in titles, not landowner, not gatekeeper, not even the woman who beat the HOA. But when the local newspaper published a Sunday feature titled, the quiet woman who outlawed the gate. I clipped it, folded it neatly, and placed it in the fireproof drawer with the original deed, not out of pride, out of permanence. Because by that point, I wasn't just protecting crops. I was protecting precedent. The Tisdale Garden Access Trust, quietly administered by a local firm 2 towns over, was now written into the HOA's operations manual. Yes, the operations manual. Page 14, subsection 3. All board decisions affecting. The eastern access gate must be reviewed by the trust lease coordinator prior to implementation. And the best part? That clause wasn't written by me. It was added by Clara, the new board president, after 3 new board members resigned in frustration. One of them called it unmanageable oversight. Clara called it stability. See, once you make power invisible, people stop trying to fight it. They just live with it. And that's what Briarwood Ridge had done. The residents adapted. The gate stayed. The sign never went up. The fire lane stayed routed. And the path to my crops was never blocked again. But I wasn't done. Because I didn't want just one HOA to remember. I wanted every future HOA developer and property planner who looked at this neighborhood to see the same blinking red flag. Do not touch this land, it bites back. So I worked with Eleanor and the trust to record what we called a legacy access covenant. It wasn't just about keeping the lease active. It was about embedding the idea of protected land inside the county system, so deep that pulling it out would be harder than building a new subdivision from scratch. We filed it during a slow zoning cycle, no attention, no resistance. It simply slid into the public record like a whisper. And just like that, the eastern gate, forever linked to my parcel, became a permanent easement locked under private terms. No public override, no board vote, no rezoning trick, untouchable. The cherry. On top, we re-registered the parcel with a new name, Tisdale Legacy Strip. It sounds simple, but every map update now shows that name. Every contractor order, every insurance renewal, every permit form, they all have to pass through it. In late spring, I got a call from the county assessor. "Ma'am, just verifying a few things," he said. "You own, 22 linear feet through the HOA gate?" "That's right." "Is that still leased?" "It is." He paused. "You do know this parcel is now listed as a strategic infrastructure choke point?" I sipped my tea. "I do." "Well," he said, "you're the only one I've ever seen who turned a tax default lot into a legal firewall." That was the idea. Clara retired the following year. She stopped by with a loaf of zucchini bread. Her garden had improved. And she said I inspired it. "You know," she said with a laugh, "we looked into getting a backup gate. But turns out there's no available frontage without cutting into county land." I smiled. "I know," I said. "I checked before you did." She stared. "You've always been 10 moves ahead, haven't you?" "No," I said. "Just one ahead." But it was always the right one. Years passed. The crop still grew. The HOA stopped fighting itself. And I stopped being the villain in the background, because in the end, I wasn't. I was the person who reminded everyone, you don't have to raise your voice if you own the ground they stand on. I updated my will. The trust continues after me. The parcel remains locked, unbreakable, unfriendly to greed, and silent in its defense. It earns nothing, costs little, but it commands everything, because if they ever want to expand, reroute, or rebuild, they'll have to go through that 22-foot strip, and that strip belongs to something more powerful than money, than bylaws, than board seats. It belongs to memory and principle, and the woman they thought they could fence out. A new neighbor moved in recently. She asked me why everyone slows down near the gate. I told her, that's where the HOA learned a lesson about maps and deeds, and how some land remembers what was done to it. She blinked, smiled, then asked if she could buy some snap peas. I gave her a whole bag, no charge, because some things you protect for profit, others you protect because They matter more than the check. The final board report I ever read had one line that made me laugh. In small font, under Community Operations, Eastern Gate, stable. Access terms unchanged, stable. That's how they described it now. Not contested, not leased, not disputed, just stable. As if the fire never happened. As if it didn't take $234 and a decade of patience to build an invisible wall strong enough to outlast concrete, because this wasn't just a revenge story. It was a boundary, one that taught them quietly and permanently. Never trespass against what you don't understand, especially when it's silent, especially when it grows things. They tried to fence me out, but I bought the land beneath their gate, and every step they take through it is a step through the lesson they'll never forget.